Okay, so now without further ado, it is my pleasure to welcome today's first speaker, Manisha Banerjee, Executive Vice President and Global Lead of Ipsos Market Strategy and Understanding. Manisha, you have the floor.
Thanks, Ellen. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Before we get into the details of how our demand moments works, I want to set the context with the fact that context matters. Demand moments for us is about wrapping demand moments within what makes brands successful. At Ipsos, we've been doing a lot of work to understand the 3 keys to unlock brand success, which are setting expectations so that only your brand can meet them, integrating context, and that's where the brand and demand moments comes into play, and acting with empathy. Can we move to the next slide, please? Thanks, Colin. The next slide, please. It's not just about these 3 elements. It's also about the fact that
Manisha, I think you have gone muted. If you can unmute your line. There we go.
Can you guys hear me? I'm sorry, I'm having lots of network challenges today. Sorry. So the 3 elements of brand success, we talked about empathy, context, and expectations. It's not just 3 ideas that we came up with. It's also the fact that we've extensively validated these 3 elements. Data that you're seeing on your screen right now talks about brands that are able to set and meet expectations, integrate context, and act with empathy, are significantly able to impact their purchase share, and as validated on IRI's household panel. Next slide, Colin. And this is not just true for CPG brands. Across multiple brands, across multiple categories, across multiple markets, what we have found is that there is a very strong relationship of these 3 elements to how people choose brands. And not only do these 3 elements individually impact brand choice, they are also interrelated. So driving any one of these helps elevate the impact of the others as well. So if you're not integrating context into how you're measuring yourself, you are missing half the story. I'll give you a little bit of an example of what we mean by context. Context usually comprises of 2 broad parts. One is macro. Think about everything that's happening in the world around us, societal, cultural, values, norms, and just prevalent issues and topics that consumers care about, that people care about, that are affecting us. We have seen an increasing impact of these macro contextual variables in how people are choosing different brands. Think about topics like sustainability and whether someone's doing good for the environment, D&I. Like, there's so many more values, specifically as you talk about, Gen Z, who are using these elements to differentiate between brands and really pick brands that stand for some of the things that matter. Having said that, there is also another component of context, which is really important to understand because it feeds directly into what Colin will talk about as he talks about demand moments, is the idea of micro-context. Micro-context is really about finding that moment and the mission of the moment for a particular consumer, shopper, whichever context we are doing our investigation in. It starts with things like logistics. Where am I? When is this? With whom am I? What is going on around me? Think about your morning coffee versus your afternoon cup of tea, or a brand that you're picking up in the grocery store. What are some of these elements and how they influence it? Needs. Sometimes it's about what needs am I trying to satisfy in that particular moment. Behavior. This is actually a much ignored piece when we think about understanding what drives brand choice, which is, what is my current behavior? Think of a category like financial services. I might watch all the advertising from all the different brands and all the different banks, but if I have a current account in a particular bank, it's going to make you're going to have to work really hard for me to have to, discontinue with that account and open a new one. So there's a huge friction in terms of changing your current behavior. So how does that play a role? And then last but not the least is the idea of market effects, which is how easy is it to make sure that you are able to, drive people to the decision that you want them to make, to your brand, to your service, to your product. To illustrate how context changes how people make choices, here is an example in the streaming category. Context matters. Over 50%, 56% in this instance, of what people do in terms of video streaming is determined by context. If you think of that context, think of it in occasions, just one way to look at context here. If you are looking at evening entertainment alone or as a couple, Netflix comes up really strong, but it has a really strong competitor in Prime Video. The moment you switch to another different context of evening entertainment with family, while Netflix still is strong, what you find is that Disney comes up to be pretty significant in its presence. A totally different context is if you're just about the house, doing something else, doing your chores, it's actually YouTube offering the flexibility of you being able to choose your content at a different time at a pace that suits you based on everything else that you're doing. So again, this example clearly highlights that if we had gone to consumers and asked them, what's the first brand of streaming that kind of comes to your mind, or which brand of streaming is your favorite, provider, you might have got one answer. But the moment we overlay the idea of context, you get what is really driving choice at that particular moment of truth. So that was a little bit of a preamble about context and why it's important to measure. Colin is going to take you through how we deep dive into this context through our unique demand spaces approach. Over to you, Colin.
Thank you. Thanks, Manisha. So Manisha has provided really a big picture view of how important context is, again, from a macro, but also a micro perspective. So what I want to do now is talk about demand spaces, to link context to demand spaces, and also show you how we create those demand spaces at Ipsos. Now, in a sense, you've actually been exposed to demand spaces already in the last example that Manisha just gave. So if you think of those three situations when people have some media entertainment, the first one was like watching it as a couple in the evening. The second one was watching it with the family in the evening as well. And then the third one was about watching something alone. In a way, those are demand spaces. Those are like three demand spaces, because what's happening during those occasions is that a product's being consumed. In that case, it's really streaming, some kind of media entertainment. And they all have different contexts. And as Manisha said, they all kind of have things that are driving what people want in those demand spaces. So in those three spaces that she just gave, they're demanding certain things, and that context is driving the demand. So let me jump into how we do our demand spaces here and how we put in context. But I'm going to start at a high level first, and then get you more into kind of the nuts and bolts. So when we do demand space at Ipsos here, what we want is we want it to be the spaces to be able to predict behavior. Okay, so that you can identify your greatest, where your brand potential lies. So if you go back again to the example Manisha just shared, if you are YouTube, well, of those three spaces that she kind of just gave you an example of, you are going to be more successful when the person's alone and not with somebody else, and that may be throughout the entire day. We want our demand spaces to be built on concrete dimension so that you can optimize your positioning, your targeting, and your product development. Again, going back to what Monisha presented, if you remember the occasion of watching with family, well, that's going to tell you what kind of content you need. It's also concrete in the sense that we're talking about a time of the day when people are watching, which is in the evening. So they're very concrete criteria. The last thing that we want to make sure that we get from our demand space is that we understand or uncover those drivers. What is it that drives someone to decide whether they're going to watch Netflix versus YouTube versus Disney kind of streaming content? So understanding those drivers are important as well. So Manisha gave you an example, but I'm going to do a deeper dive into like just one person, just to give you a sense of how complex it can be when we talk about context. So let's just consider this guy on the screen here. He's a young dude. He's like 25 years old, got a full-time job. He's living alone in the city. It's Monday to Friday, it's his work day. So he gets up in the morning, he doesn't have much time and he wants to rush to work, but he's not quite awake yet and he wants to recharge his energy. So that's a need there. He's hungry, but he wants something nutritious. So he doesn't want to just stuff his face with, something that's not healthy. So what we do is we collect this information for each person that we interview. And we want to understand, what is it that drives their choice here? In this case here, the example, this person's choice is to have a protein yogurt drink. So we want to understand, does being young and single and having a full-time job drive that behavior? Is it because in the morning and he needs something to recharge his energy? What does he want? Does he want a quick and fulfilling breakfast? Do those things drive his behavior? Now, Monisha started off with talking about, brand choice, but it also could be category choice, right? Because this young man there are many different options in terms of a beverage. It doesn't have to be a protein yogurt drink. He could have gone with soy milk. He could have gone with orange juice. The point is when we do a demand space approach, we're trying to predict a certain kind of behavior. And what behavior? Well, it's whatever behavior you are interested in influencing. So if you're interested in influencing brand choice behavior, then that would be what we want to focus on. If you're interested in determining what product category someone chooses, then that could be what we're trying to understand what the drivers are. Okay? So at a big picture level, so I showed you an example of just one guy. Well, when we do our studies, we have, we're going out to many people, and we want to find on the aggregate across everyone in our sample, what is it that seems to drive the choice of behavior that you are most interested in, whether that it's brand choice or category choice. So this is just an illustration to show you that, we're going to look at everything that we can think of, like, people's characteristics, the context in which the consumption takes place, what kind of needs do they have, and so on, to understand what is the relative impact of all these things on driving the choice of behavior that is relevant to you. So once we have those drivers, once we understand what those drivers are, then we say, let's take the key ones, okay, the key ones that we want to use to create the demand spaces. So demand spaces essentially is a form of segmentation. And like any segmentation, you have to decide what is it that you want to use to create those segments, all right? You don't want to just dump the whole kitchen sink in this bucket and just say, let it fall out and let's see what we get. You want to be choiceful. You want to be choiceful in terms of what are the key drivers that drive the behavior that you are most interested in. But you also want to be choiceful on things that you can act on. So maybe some things are more actionable than others. For example, age and gender. Well, knowing age and gender of the different demand space means that you'll be able to better target those people from a media perspective, because age and gender are those two variables that are very common in terms of buying like media. So it's driven by analysis, but you also want to be driven by what you can do on the back end. So once you've decided on what goes into this bucket to create those demand space, then for example, here you may get 4 different demand spaces. And the 4 different demand spaces will be characterized in terms of people's needs, the purpose stuff, in terms of like maybe the personal characteristics or demographics like age and gender, and whatever we put in this bucket to get those 4 demand spaces. And the names themselves, like any segmentation study, is just something that we come out with by looking at the entire profile of each space. Okay. So just want to sum up real quickly before we move on. Why we feel like this is a good approach to get a demand space. One, it's really one big gigantic segmentation. We are aware that there are some in the industries who will do things like they'll run a people segmentation, for example, and they may run a needs segmentation, and then they'll try to cross-tabulate the two, and you could do that. We feel that when you do that, it's not the most efficient approach because you're increasing the study design, you're increasing the analysis cost. So by doing one segmentation, we feel like that's the most efficient way to get it in. It's also the most optimal way because you're putting everything together in the same bucket at the same time. We believe that what we're doing helps us focus. So we are selecting what is used to create the demand spaces. Again, we can look at the driver analysis to determine what most impact the behavior you're trying to influence. But we're also thinking about on the back end, what are those variables that are most actionable to you? And finally, it's all about business impact, right? So again, this goes back to what I'm talking about, that in the beginning, you do want to understand what is it that you're really trying to impact from your marketing activities. Is it brand choice? Is it category choice? Is it something else? Okay, and use that to drive how the demand space is created. Now, the title of our webinar was 4 Ways to Ignite Brand Growth. So I am going to give you the 4 ways because otherwise it would just be clickbait. So the 4 ways are listed up here. Okay, so there is, how do you determine what is the best brand portfolio strategy for you? Okay, how do you determine the best brand positioning or repositioning for your brand to make sure you stay relevant to your consumer? What kind of new products should you be thinking about in your pipeline and developing? Who should you be targeting? So I'm going to cover this in a kind of a generic sense, and then I'll give you some case studies after this so that it'll be a little bit more concrete. So the demand space, visually, this is one way to think about it. So like in this example, again, there are 4 demand spaces. Now, for this presentation, we made it 4 to keep it simple. But sometimes it could be as many as 12 demand spaces, 9, 10. You're going to have a lot of different spaces that you can play. And so really the first question you have to think about is, do I want to play in all these spaces? Okay, if there are 12 spaces, you don't want to play in all 12 spaces. It's unlikely that you are able to play in all 12 spaces. There's just too many. So really the first question most of the time when we do a demand space is, which space do I want to play in? Now, one way you answer that question in the demand space study is by understanding where are the spaces that your brands currently play in. So let's just imagine for a minute that you have more than one brand in your portfolio. And for this study, let's say you have 2 brands. What you may find from doing a demand space study is you may find that, hey, you have 2 brands, brand A and brand B, and right now they fall in 2 of these demand spaces, self leisure care and family care. Now, a demand space allows you to answer the question. So just because you fall in these 2 spaces right now, does it not mean that you could not play in another space? For example, you may look at energy boosts and you may say, well, it looks like brand A could go into energy boost as well, okay? So it's really getting an understanding of what each demand space is about, where your brand falls into, which space does it fall into, how well does it fall into the space right now. Just because you fall into a certain demand space right now doesn't mean that you're doing the best that you can. So that might mean, for example, that brand B may fall into family care, but really when we start looking into other questions in the study, we find that brand B really is not optimized for this demand space, and that you need to do something to reposition yourself to fit better within family care. So that's about brand portfolio strategy and repositioning, determining where your brands are currently, but also how well does it fit within each space. Then that's the question of innovation. What do you need to create in your innovation pipeline down the road? And again, a demand space study is meant to give you that information, which is, here are the needs within this demand space. And we can even ask, like, what is the unmet needs within the space? And if you have that, you can kind of determine and get some guidelines in terms of what innovations do you need to create for this demand space, that demand space. And again, you can create innovation in demand space that you're not currently in. You may be able to introduce a new brand, all right? And finally, it's once you've decided which space to play in, understanding who are the people in these spaces. What are the demographic characteristics? What are the psychographic characteristics? How do these people interact with media? So it's basically, this is a visualization of a demand space. The way I like it, because I like to look at things visually. It's a map. It is a map to tell you, here is the world that are possibilities. Where you are now, in which part of the world are you now? And where can you go from today? You do not just have to stay in the parts of the world that you're currently in. Okay, you can move on somewhere else. So moving on now to more concrete actual case studies that we've done. So I just gave you something very generic so that you can hopefully imagine it on yourself, but I'll give you some snippets of cases that we've done. Here's one that was a demand space was done for a beverage packaging manufacturer, and they needed some kind of roadmap, a strategic roadmap to grow their business and be more effective in sales. Because they manufacture packaging, they also wanted to inspire their customers in product and brand development by helping them to identify market opportunities. Now, what they had done previously was that they actually done a segmentation based only on needs, okay? And because of that, they didn't have information on they didn't have more information on location. So they realized that they needed to get deeper insights for location and contact. What we found in this study is that in addition to needs, there were other things that was driving choice. Age, where people were consuming the beverage, what activity they were doing. Maybe they were just watching TV, maybe they were at the fitness center, and location drove choice. So what did we do? We built the demand spaces around these variables. 12 demand spaces were identified, We were able to profile them on need, target location, activities, location, and so on. And we help them prioritize the demand spaces. So again, that's really the first question is you have all these demand space. What is it that is most important for you that will match your company's strength and the brands that you have and your capabilities? And then we also help them to determine within this demand space that they have chosen to go after, what are the innovation opportunities. So from this, we did get some feedback for this particular study. And really the client was most pleased was the part about the information that was available to help them with their innovation strategy. Here's a second case study. This one is for financial news. So this is everyone's common knowledge, I would think, by now, that the newspaper business is pretty much dying and that you need to transform if you want to survive. So this client was a media company that's been around a long time, and they wanted to understand how to transform their business. And their focus was on financial news. We had only 6 demand space in this study. And the interesting thing here, I think, to point out was that we identified 3 spaces. 2 of them we define as the core opportunity space, with 1 additional opportunity looking further out. So I think some of you may have experienced this, where you see opportunity. There's some that are closer in. You know that you can get there quickly, maybe within the next year or 2. But there are some opportunities sometimes that are 5 years down the road. Perhaps you need to do some R&D. Perhaps you need to do some capital investment. So again, this also helps with the strategic planning, and saying that your innovation pipeline can stretch from 2 to 5 to maybe 6, 7 years. We also provide recommendations on how to evolve the client's offer in terms of brand positioning, also in terms of specific content. The content, what is it that is going to go into this financial news that would be of interest in the different spaces. And so here's the last case study. This one was for a QSR client. And it's what's interesting because during the summer, they get a lot more traffic. Now, to do even better during the summer, our client wanted to understand the consumer's mindset, behavior, and attitude during the summer period. Now, this is by definition context, because we understand, I think intuitively, you understand that our behavior in summer is going to be quite different than in winter, for example. And so in this case here, the client specifically wanted to make sure they understand during summertime, how do people behave when it comes to eating at quick serve restaurants, right? The impact here was relatively simple. We just helped them pretty much size the demand space. So I didn't talk about that previously, but all the demand spaces can be sized as well in terms of some kind of dollar estimate in terms of what the potential would be if you were to go after a certain demand space. We help them to think about communication to the target segment, and as well as app modifications. So in this case here, this client had an app that was linked to the restaurant items, and how do they think about modifying the app so that it is appropriate for the summer. Okay. In this case here, the feedback we got was that what the client really liked was in terms of the communications insights and the whole experience from the customer. And I'm going to hand it over to Manisha now so that she can link it to more key marketing activities.
Thanks, Colin. Just to kind of summarize what Colin walked us through, there are 3 ways to think about how demand moments and the way we do it is unique. One is that it is not, 3 or 4 different segmentations brought together. It's really one unified segmentation that approach that we use, so that as a marketer, you can truly prioritize which variables you want to act on. Second, we let the data play out and tell us what the options are and how we may want to look at the story versus predetermining some of those variables. And last but not the least, perhaps the most important part, is the fact that we are always focused on driving a business outcome. One of the action standards that we will always have when we do a demand moments or demand space project is that it ties to category choice, brand choice, targeting, starting with the end in mind. And we definitely are big advocates of that. One of the challenges of work like demand spaces, which tends to be fundamental to how you might look at your market, how you might look at your game board, the where to play field, is that if you cannot embed it in other marketing processes and activities, it's a nice to have versus something that is truly useful. This unique approach in which we do the demand spaces work helps us make sure that it can be integrated to everything else that you might be doing to understand and stay in touch with your consumers, whether it's brand health tracking, whether it's being able to tie it to CRM databases, to media planning and strategy, either through activation through the DMPs, making sure that we are bringing in some of those variables even as we think about that demand moments. Again, like I talked about, starting with the end in mind. So as we get into the conversation and the engagement, we predetermine what variables we want to make sure that we include in the measurement, so that they can be at the back end integrated to some of these systems that you're looking at all the time and making decisions, whether it's as simple as qualitative research or even embedding into, like I said, innovation and kind of product development. So many ways in which the process can be embedded in all your activities. So in closing, we've obviously learned a lot from all this experience that we have in demand moments and demand spaces work. Our clients are testament, to the work that we do for them. Very simple questions. And if you have any of those, definitely would love to have that conversation. Is whether you want to move into new spaces, occasions, or contexts. How do you want to target different consumers, or you want to target the whole human? The consumer is a human and not just your consumer. How do you drive and deploy your best brand portfolio? And what are some of those opportunities to drive growth, whether it is through driving frequency or through driving penetration? So if you have any of these questions, feel free to reach out to us, and we'd love to continue the conversation. So I'm going to hand it over to Ellen to see if there are any questions that she might want to ask us.
Well, so yes, our attendees do have questions already. So the first one, maybe a good one for you, Manisha. How do you approach market and dollar sizing of the opportunity, acknowledging the fact that claimed survey data isn't representative of the literal market in counts?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll take a shot at it, and then I'll pass it on to Colin. He's our chief analytics and research officer, so I'm sure he'll have a lot of more detailed responses. But overarchingly, I think there are a couple of ways that we try to get past this hurdle. One, in a lot of categories, you do have existing POS or panel data, and you're able to bring some of that in right up front to make sure that you can tie it to the survey data. Most of the times, we will always suggest this hybrid approach. Specifically in CPG categories, there is definitely access to household panel, and in the US, we're at no shortage for some of these data sources. So that's the first one, where we want to make sure that it kind of ties back to actual category and brand data and calibrated accordingly. Secondly, I think sometimes it's also to do with the measurement. So whether we are doing a a recall-based survey where we're asking people to replay some of their behaviors. I'm going to use the context of let's say snacking, where you ask someone based either on a diary or on like a past 24-hour recall. You're asking them what they're doing. Some of the ways in which we ask the questions, we have behavioral science experts here at Ipsos who help us make sure that we are framing the question in the best possible way so that it can help us remove some of those memory and recall based kind of biases. Having said that, a lot of work that we are actually already doing has been in the integration of real-time measurement. So whether it's through app-based data capture, whether it's through integrating devices where possible to be able to capture not just someone's recalled stimulus, but also, for example, having people upload videos or pictures, or passively tracking when it comes to let's say device usage. Think of laundry, think of coffee machines, think of refrigerators, microwaves. There's so much in the home that you could have access to. So for some of our clients, we're already starting to, experiment a lot with making sure that the data capture itself is, addressing some of that memory and recall bias. So one is through analytics that you try to calibrate for it. The second bucket is really through how well we're able to capture the data and eliminate some of that. Colin, anything you'd like to add to that?
Just a little, but you mentioned it already. From an analytic perspective, the way it's typically done is through calibration. And just to provide a little bit more details than that, as the person who posed the question pointed out, survey data estimates can be overstated or understated. It could go either way, depending on the brand. So oftentimes what we do is we do go out to look for external data validation outside of the survey. And that may come in the form of syndicated data if it's available, like in the US or Canada. And if it's not, then sometimes we do go to our clients too, because at the very least, you will have the information, their own sales information, that you can use as a benchmark. So like if the survey suggests a certain number, but the client brand sales number is a different one, then that at least gives you a sense of, what's the degree of overstatement or understatement, and you could use that as a calibration point to think about how to adjust the other numbers as well. So there's some assumptions made, but the gist of it is that you do need to move beyond survey data if the sizing piece is critical.
Wow, that's excellent. Okay, yeah, Colin, here's another one. Maybe you can continue on with how do you determine what are the drivers of choice?
Okay, so in one of the slides we talked about determining the key drivers. So I'm guessing the question relates to that. So in terms of demand space, what we do is the data is collected through surveys, and as part of the questionnaire, what we do is we ask people like when they consume a product, right? Like what time of the day it was, whether it was the weekend or weekday, where were they, who was with them. We have the information on the demographics. We collect information on why they consumed the product, like what was their need. So you have all that data. And essentially, we use machine learning technique called random forest. You can think of it just really as a driver analysis. And we link all the information we've collected from the survey to a outcome measure, the behavior that you're most interested in. So whether that's what is the brand most often for a particular person, or perhaps it's what is the product category they use most for a particular occasion. So the random forest analysis is used to determine which of all the information that we collected is most related to the choice of behavior that you are trying to influence. So that's what we do essentially. It's using analysis technique. Random forest is just one example that we use to determine the drivers.
Wow, that was very excellent. So while we do have a few more questions, I'm cognizant of the fact that we are at time. So we'll follow up with people directly after this webinar. Of course, in the meantime, please reach out directly to our presenters with any other follow-up questions. Please also be on the lookout for a direct link to today's recorded presentation so that you can revisit the details that were presented by Colin and Manisha. And thank you again, everyone, for joining us. That now concludes today's Ipsos webinar. Have a wonderful day, guys.
All right, thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.